Did you know that a union of medieval merchants without a king defeats sovereign kingdoms, monopolize global trade, and shape the borders of Northern Europe? The medieval European landscape was fundamentally defined by the rigid constraints of feudalism, a system in which absolute power was measured in the ownership of land, the construction of fortified castles, and the divine right of hereditary kings. Monarchs, dukes, and margraves concerned themselves almost exclusively with dynastic marriages, territorial conquests, and extracting ever-increasing taxes from an impoverished peasantry. They were rarely noted for their interest in trade, viewing commerce merely as a secondary source of taxation to fund their endless chivalric feuding. Yet, emerging from the chaotic, fragmented shores of the Baltic and North Seas in the 12th century was a geopolitical anomaly that defied every established convention of medieval statecraft. It possessed no sovereign ruler, maintained no standing army, held no central treasury, and operated without a formal written constitution. It was a decentralized, stateless superpower forged not by the iron swords of the nobility, but by the meticulous ledgers of common burghers. This was the Hanseatic League, a formidable confederation of merchant guilds and market towns that would come to dominate Northern European trade for more than 4 centuries. Operating across a vast and treacherous geographical expanse that stretched from the deep, ancient forests of Russia in the east to the bustling maritime ports of England in the west, the Hanseatic League achieved a level of economic hegemony that allowed it to dictate terms to emperors, manipulate the succession of crowns, and starve entire kingdoms into political submission. At its absolute zenith, the network encompassed nearly 200 affiliated cities and settlements across 8 modern-day countries. The merchants of the Hansa transformed the unforgiving waters of the Baltic Sea into their own private lake, standardizing trade regulations, establishing fiercely protected extraterritorial colonies, and utilizing devastating trade blockades and naval warfare to crush anyone who dared challenge their commercial monopolies. To understand how a decentralized union of merchants managed to defeat sovereign kingdoms, monopolize global trade, and irreversibly shape the geographical and political borders of Northern Europe is to understand the violent birth of modern transnational commerce and the devastating, unyielding power of economic warfare. The story of the Hanseatic League does not begin with a grand royal decree, but with the quiet, persistent courage of early seafarers braving the icy waters of the north. Long before the League formalized its overwhelming power, maritime trade in the Baltic Sea was largely the exclusive domain of Scandinavian seafarers. By the 9th century, these early merchants, transitioning from the era of Viking raids to organized commerce, had established prominent and lucrative trading hubs at Birka, Heidebu, and Schleswig. As the Viking Age gradually waned, the center of maritime commercial gravity shifted inevitably to the strategically located island of Gotland. The sailors of Gotland, operating primarily out of the thriving city of Visby, conducted ambitious exploratory trading ventures and opportunistic raids across the Baltic, navigating complex river systems as far east as the mouth of the river Neva in northwestern Russia, and traveling onward to the great trading center of Novgorod. As early as the 12th century, Low German merchants began to follow these treacherous routes. In 1080, Visby merchants had already established a trading post in Novgorod known as the Gutegard, cementing the initial commercial arteries that would later define the Baltic economy. In 1160, a group of ambitious German merchants formally set up a transit station in Visby to facilitate the transportation of wares among the coastal towns of the region. It is a testament to the deep historical roots of Northern European exploration that modern scholars, reflecting on the cultural historiography of the region, draw parallels between the curiosity of ancient seafarers like Pytheas and the intrepid Hanseatic merchants who built a cultural renaissance in the north that rivaled the contemporary developments in medieval Italy.
The true catalyst for the creation of the Hanseatic League, however, occurred on the northern coast of modern-day Germany. In 1159, Henry the Lion, the powerful Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, captured the region from Adolf II, Count of Schauenberg and Holstein, and aggressively rebuilt the town of Lübeck. Following a devastating fire that leveled the settlement in 1157, Duke Henry refounded the city, and recognizing the necessity of commerce for regional stability, endowed it with numerous unprecedented rights and freedoms, actively attracting ambitious Low German merchants who sought to escape the crushing taxation of local feudal lords. Lübeck's geographical positioning was exceptionally strategic. Situated on the banks of the Trave River with direct sheltered access to the Baltic Sea, it served as the perfect transshipment port, connecting the resource-rich, underdeveloped Eastern Baltic with the highly developed, wealthy markets of the North Sea. Under the reign of King Valdemar II of Denmark, Lübeck was elevated to the prestigious status of a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire in 1226, granting it allegiance only to the emperor himself and freeing it from the capricious interference of the surrounding nobility. The seminal moment in the formation of the Hanseatic League, the spark that ignited this commercial empire, came in 1241. In that year, Lübeck forged a formal commercial and defensive alliance with the neighboring city of Hamburg. This alliance was predicated on a profound, world-altering economic synergy. Lübeck controlled access to the incredibly lucrative fishing grounds of the Baltic and North Seas, but fish spoiled rapidly without chemical preservation. Hamburg, conversely, controlled the inland trade routes leading directly from the massive salt production center of Lüneburg. By fusing Lübeck's endless supply of fish with Hamburg's Lüneburg salt, the two cities monopolized the salted fish trade. This was a vital commodity in a medieval Europe strictly bound by the dietary laws of Catholic fasting, which rigidly prohibited meat consumption on Fridays and during the prolonged season of Lent. This monopoly, particularly over the famous Scania herring market, generated immense, unprecedented wealth and demonstrated the overwhelming, world-bending power of municipal cooperation.
As German colonists moved aggressively eastward along the Baltic coast during the 12th and 13th centuries, establishing major fortified cities like Reval, Tallinn, Riga, and Dorpat, Tartu, they carried this fiercely cooperative model with them. Given the extreme limits and dangers of medieval communications, guilds of traveling merchants, known as Hansas, an old High German word meaning convoy or crowd, banded together. Their main aims were to share the immense financial risks of long-distance maritime travel, suppress the rampant piracy that plagued the coasts, and negotiate from a position of collective strength with quarrelsome and greedy feudal overlords. Bound by deep economic interdependence, complex familial ties, and a shared lingua franca of Middle-Low German, these disparate merchant convoys gradually solidified into a vast network of allied cities. This organic, market-driven evolution transformed the early Kaufmannshans, an alliance of individual traveling merchants, into the Städtehans, a terrifyingly powerful alliance of sovereign merchant cities. The sheer logistical achievement of the Hanseatic League is difficult to overstate, and it was entirely predicated on major advancements in maritime technology and infrastructure. In an era where a journey from Reval to Lübeck could take 4 weeks in the summer and up to 4 grueling months in the winter, maintaining a cohesive trade network required revolutionary advancements in both maritime technology and civic administration. The merchants of the Hansa were not merely traders, they were the vanguard of maritime engineering. To protect their massive investments from the jagged coastlines of Northern Europe, League members systematically trained professional maritime pilots and financed the construction of a vast network of lighthouses. Lübeck erected what is widely considered Northern Europe's first proper lighthouse in Falsterbo in 1202, and by the year 1600, at least 15 Hanseatic lighthouses illuminated the German and Scandinavian coasts, rendering it the best-lighted, safest coastline in the entire world. The vessel that made this empire possible was the Hanseatic cog, an incredible piece of naval architecture that began to appear in the 10th century and reached absolute dominance by the 12th century, progressively replacing the older, smaller Viking-style Nars across northern waters. The cog was a sturdy vessel designed meticulously for bulk transport. It featured clinker-built sides, overlapping wooden planks, and a flush-planked flat bottom that was constructed shell-first. This flat bottom was a revolutionary logistical advantage. It allowed the cog to settle perfectly level on the seabed in tidal harbors, making the loading and unloading of massive cargo shipments incredibly easy compared to rounded-hull ships. Constructed predominantly of heavy oak timber, a typical seagoing cog ranged from 15 to 25 meters in length and 5 to 8 meters in width. While earlier ships were incredibly small, the booming demand for bulk goods across the Hanseatic sphere drove shipwrights to scale these vessels up massively, with standard cogs carrying between 30 and 200 tons of cargo. Propelled by a single mast bearing a massive square-rigged sail, the ship was not fast, but it offered unbeatable economies of scale. Furthermore, the cog was notoriously difficult for pirates to attack. Its exceptionally high, straight sides made it incredibly difficult for hostile raiders to board during a sea fight, a defensive capability augmented by the addition of raised platforms at the bow and stern, the forecastle and aftercastle, where archers could rain down fire on attackers.
Perhaps the most significant technological leap associated with the cog was the adoption of the stern-mounted central rudder. Prior to the 1240s, most ships relied on a side-mounted steering oar, which was highly vulnerable to damage and less efficient for maneuvering large, heavy vessels. The stern post rudder allowed the massive cogs to navigate the treacherous, narrow channels of the Baltic Sea with a level of precision previously impossible. The archaeological discovery of the Bremen cog in 1962, a remarkably well-preserved wreck dating precisely to 1380, confirmed just how robust and scientifically advanced these vessels were, proving definitively that a decentralized merchant network could drive the cutting edge of global engineering. The cog allowed merchants to transport bulk goods, timber, grain, salt, and beer at economies of scale that no other European power could match. To coordinate an empire spanning such distances without a monarch or a central bureaucracy required a radical departure from traditional feudal governance. The Hanseatic League functioned through a decentralized, highly sophisticated network of municipal self-government, heavily anchored by a brilliant legal framework known as Lübeck law, Lübisches Recht. Originally based on the municipal laws of the town of Soest, the citizens of Lübeck developed a comprehensive legal code that replaced the personal rule of tribal monarchs and regional dukes with the rule of law. Following its initial codification, Lübeck law was actively exported to over 100 newly founded or allied cities across the Baltic region, serving as the civic glue that held the League together. Many cities in the Hanseatic League adopted this system, including Hamburg in 1188, Rostock in 1218, Stralsund in 1334, and Reval in 1248. Not all cities adopted Lübeck law, however. Some, like Danzig after 1295, adopted Magdeburg law, which similarly regulated internal autonomy but featured distinct parallel communal and legal autonomy for populations such as the Jewish communities living within those cities. Unlike feudal law, which concentrated absolute power in the hands of hereditary nobility, Lübeck law placed the day-to-day administration of a city directly into the hands of a bourgeois merchant class. Authority was vested in a city council, the Rat, typically composed of 20 Ratsherren, city councilors. These men were not democratically elected by the general populace, nor were they appointed by a distant king. Instead, the council operated through a system of co-optation. When a member died or retired, the remaining councilors selected his replacement from among the city's most successful, experienced, and influential long-distance merchants, alongside a few highly educated, university-trained lawyers known as syndics. This oligarchic system ruthlessly prioritized economic stability and commercial expertise over all other political concerns. To prevent the formation of entrenched aristocratic dynasties that might mirror the feudal lords they sought to escape, Lübeck law instituted a strict, unbreakable rule.
a father and his son, or two biological brothers, were permanently forbidden from serving on the city council at the same time. This ensured that influential families could not consolidate too large a share of influence over the city's politics. The council elected up to 4 burgomasters from its own ranks to create a remarkably stable, business-oriented government that could plan in decades rather than merely reacting to the whims of a volatile monarch. These burgomasters were held to extreme standards of accountability. Their terms were nominally for 2 years, but they were routinely asked to remain in office, effectively turning their service into a life term. However, historical records from the Middle Ages demonstrate that burgomasters of Hanseatic cities who engaged in unsuccessful, highly destructive or corrupt politics could be, and sometimes were, brutally sentenced to death by their peers. In cities where Lübeck law was adopted, local disputes were settled locally, but complex appeals and sweeping legal interpretations were sent back to the City Council of Lübeck, ensuring a uniform legal environment across the entire Hanseatic sphere. This legal standardization allowed a merchant from Riga to sign a contract in Bremen with complete confidence that the terms would be uniformly enforced.
When issues arose that affected the entire league, such as the negotiation of foreign privileges, the imposition of embargoes, or the declaration of war, the cities convened a grand assembly known as the Hanseatic Diet, Tagfart. Usually hosted in Lübeck, which earned the title Queen of the Hansa, these assemblies were irregular, occurring 172 times over a span of 311 years. The League lacked a formal constitution, and the Diet operated strictly on the basis of deliberation and consensus. While this decentralized structure allowed for incredible flexibility and local autonomy, it was also the source of endless internal friction. The economic interests of the western Rhineland cities, such as Cologne, often clashed violently with those of the eastern Prussian and Wendish cities. Yet, when faced with a common external threat, this loose confederation could mobilize staggering financial resources and naval power, transforming commercial cogships into heavily armed warships in a matter of weeks, and instituting elaborate league-wide systems of taxation to fund their defense. While the Hanseatic League projected incredible power outwardly against foreign kings, maintaining internal discipline among fiercely independent merchant cities required brutal, uncompromising mechanisms of control. The most dramatic example of this internal policing occurred during the so-called Great Shift, Große Schicht, of Brunswick in 1374. A massive, bloody uprising erupted within the city when disgruntled craft guilds and citizens rose up against the ruling patrician city council. The violence was swift and merciless. The rebels publicly executed 10 members of the city council in the streets of Brunswick. The surviving members of the governing body barely escaped with their lives, fleeing the city and riding desperately to the Hanseatic Diet, which had been hastily relocated from Stralsund to Lübeck. Standing before the assembled delegates of the League, the traumatized fugitives delivered a harrowing account of the slaughter, pleading with the unified cities to restore order so they would not remain dishonored and exiled. The shocking violence deeply scarred the collective memory of the Hanseatic region, with contemporary chronicles describing the event as if hell itself had broken loose within Brunswick's walls. For the first time in its history, the Hanseatic League decided to intervene decisively in the internal, domestic affairs of a member city. In 1375, the Diet officially declared Brunswick to be verhanst. Verhansung was the ultimate economic weapon, total banishment and exclusion from the League. Practically overnight, the merchants of Brunswick lost all their trading privileges, toll exemptions, and the physical protection of the League, utterly devastating the city's economy. The crushing weight of the blockade forced the city to capitulate, and it was not until 1380 that Brunswick was finally readmitted to the Hanseatic Circle. The League never forgot the terror of the Great Shift. To ensure that populist uprisings would never again threaten the oligarchic stability of their trade networks, the Hanseatic Diet codified Verhansung into strict law. In the Statutes of Sedition, Aufruhrstatuten of 1418, the League officially mandated absolute banishment as the automatic, non-negotiable punishment for any community that dared to violently revolt against its established city council.
This powerful tool ensured that the patrician merchant class maintained an iron grip on the governance of Northern Europe, suppressing any democratic or guild-led revolutions that might disrupt the steady flow of commerce. The geopolitical power of the Hanseatic League was inextricably linked to its absolute control over the flow of essential commodities. The League acted as the great middleman of Europe, connecting the raw, unexploited resources of the East with the manufactured wealth of the West. Cities like Bremen became highly specialized hubs for the textile and spice trade, famously erecting a statue of Roland to symbolize their merchant freedom. Riga served as the Baltic trade center, boasting a diverse economy centered on timber, furs, and grains, while Tallinn functioned as the crucial link between Western Europe and the vast expanse of Russia. Grain was the ultimate weapon of the Hanseatic League. By controlling the massive grain inflows from the fertile lands of Prussia and Poland, the League literally held the power of life and death over the less arable regions of Northern Europe. It was Hanseatic grain that allowed for more permanent, sustainable human settlements further north in Norway, where the climate was too harsh to support large-scale agriculture. When the League wished to exert political pressure, they simply halted the grain ships, bringing sovereign nations to the brink of starvation. Equally important to the Hanseatic economy was the production and export of beer. In the Middle Ages, water was often unsafe to drink, making beer an essential source of daily hydration and calories. The Hanseatic towns produced the most highly valued beer in Europe, with Wendish cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, Wismar, and Rostock developing massive export breweries that perfected the use of hopped beer. Hops acted as a natural preservative, allowing the beer to survive long sea voyages without spoiling, effectively turning beer into a highly lucrative, non-perishable export commodity that flooded the markets of England and the Low Countries. The trade in timber, pitch, tar, flax, and hemp, the vital materials required to build and maintain the navies of Europe, was also entirely monopolized by the Hansa. No European king could build a war fleet without purchasing the raw materials from Hanseatic merchants. Furthermore, the League controlled the immense trade in beeswax. Harvested from wild bees across a vast territory stretching from Lviv to Kazan, beeswax was usually shipped over the sea to supply the insatiable demand of the Catholic Church. Every cathedral, parish, and monastery in Europe required massive quantities of beeswax candles for their daily rituals, elevating wax to a strategic commodity akin to crude oil in the modern era. The massive demand for North Sea and Baltic fish culminated annually at the Scania market, located on the Scania Peninsula in present-day Sweden. Every year between August and November, massive schools of herring appeared off the coast, prompting the League to establish sprawling, legally autonomous seasonal trading colonies known as vites directly on the beach. These seasonal outposts temporarily transformed the desolate shoreline into a bustling miniature city, where raw fish was preserved with Lüneburg salt and shipped across Europe to feed Catholic populations observing meatless Fridays. Because the Russian demand for Western goods, such as herring, copper, tin, lead, salt, and wine, was relatively limited compared to the European appetite for furs and wax, the Hanseatic merchants could not avoid a massive trade imbalance. Consequently, large quantities of Western silver flowed continuously into Russia to pay for these goods, and from there, the silver flowed further east into Persia. This relentless drain of precious metals contributed to significant economic and liquidity crises within the broader European economy, demonstrating the profound macroeconomic ripple effects generated by Hanseatic's trade strategies. The sheer, unprecedented reach of the Hanseatic League was anchored by their foreign trading posts, known as Kontors, literally meaning office or counting house. These were not mere warehouses or simple trade depots. They were massive, highly organized, extraterritorial enclaves established in key foreign markets, operating with profound, legally recognized autonomy. The local authorities of the host nations were explicitly barred from entering these compounds, allowing the Hanseatic merchants to live entirely under their own laws, speak their own language, and ruthlessly enforce their own monopolies on foreign soil. The four major Kontors, Novgorod, Bergen, London, and Bruges, formed the invincible cornerstones of Hanseatic global trade, each with its own distinct culture, vital commodities, and methods of operation. In the Deep East, the Republic of Novgorod served as the vital, irreplaceable conduit for the resources of the Russian hinterland. Here, the Hanseatic League established their great contour, the Peterhof, located far up the Volkhov River. Prior to the establishment of the Peterhof, the Scandinavian Gotlandic traders had utilized a trading post in Novgorod called the Gutegard or St. Olaf's Hof. However, as the Hansa took absolute control, Novgorod was the ultimate source for medieval Europe's insatiable status-driven demand for luxury furs. Furs were truly the beating economic engine of the Peterhof. The demand for squirrel, ermine, and sable pelts to line the lavish garments of English, French, and Italian nobility was staggering. Furs were so central to the Novgorodan economy that they transcended being a mere commodity. They were utilized as literal form of currency. Specific words for squirrel fur, such as vivrets, vekshi, and bailey, were used colloquially to mean money. To manage this massive volume, the merchants formalized a standard bundle of 40 pelts, known as a sorachak, which served as a fundamental monetary unit, heavily documented on birch bark texts, tribute bag seals, and tally sticks across the region. Hanseatic maritime records indicate that individual ships departing from Estonia could carry upwards of 230,000 squirrel pelts at a single time, generating incalculable wealth. To regulate this delicate and highly lucrative trade, the Peterhof operated under a unique code of regulations known as the Schra. Revised 7 times between the 13th and 17th centuries, the Schra rigidly controlled every aspect of daily life, taxation, duties, and contact with outsiders. Because the supply of export goods was strictly limited by the harsh Russian winters, the Kontors administration enforced severe quotas to prevent market saturation. The League allowed a maximum of only 200 merchants to reside in the Peterhof at any given time, restricting their stays strictly to either the winter or summer seasons.
Furthermore, individual imports were strictly capped at 1,000 Lübeck marks per merchant to artificially restrict supply and inflate prices. Life in the Peterhof was characterized by deep isolation and strict, uncompromising segregation. Surrounded entirely by a heavy wooden palisade with only a single gate bordering the bustling market of Novgorod, the German merchants lived in what amounted to an armed camp. To protect their invaluable trade secrets and prevent cultural assimilation, the Hanseatic League instituted draconian rules. Russian men were strictly forbidden from entering the Peterhof courtyard at night. However, the rules were highly pragmatic when it suited the merchants. Russian women were permitted to enter the Kontors' bathhouse, and German apprentices were frequently sent to live as servants for local boyars or with local farmers, specifically to learn the Russian language and gather commercial intelligence. When local disputes arose, the Hansards were fully capable of imposing trade blockades on Moscow, redirecting their trade through Riga, Revel, and Pskov to financially starve their opponents. On the rugged, unforgiving western coast of Norway, the Hanseatic League established a massive contour in Bergen, known as the Bryggen, also known as the Tyska Bryggen, or the Bridge of the Germans. Bergen was generally regarded as the Scandinavians' largest commercial hub, the largest city in Norway until the 19th century, and served as the crucial gateway to the vast fisheries of the North Atlantic. The primary commodity here was stockfish, unsalted cod naturally dried by freezing air and wind on wooden racks. Stockfish could last for years without spoiling and was the primary protein source that fed the armies and navies of Europe. The Bryggen was an architectural marvel and a sociological anomaly. To maximize space and control, the Hanseatic League constructed massive 30 merchant yards along the waterfront. Each yard was built on a long, extremely narrow plot measuring 10 to 20 meters wide, but stretching back a full 100 meters from the harbor. Structurally, each plot featured a large, representative house facing the sea, hiding a dense courtyard containing smaller 3-story houses and deep storage facilities.
A single yard contained nearly 90 rooms. At its absolute peak, the Bryggen accommodated up to 2,000 Hanseatic merchants and apprentices, representing a massive, intimidating demographic force in a city whose total population was only around 10,000 people. Life in the Bryggen was notoriously harsh. The weather was utterly abysmal, frequently featuring 200 consecutive days of freezing rain and long, psychologically taxing dark winters. The Kontor was populated almost entirely by young, highly ambitious, unmarried men from cities like Lübeck, Wismar, and Rostock, who viewed Bergen as a grueling hardship posting necessary to launch a lucrative career in long-distance trade. To ensure absolute loyalty to the Hansa and prevent the merchants from integrating into local society, which might lead to the creation of an independent merchant city rather than a controlled colony, the League enforced strict celibacy rules. Women were entirely banned from living on the Bryggen, and fraternization with Norwegian women was legally prohibited, though secret relationships occasionally surfaced in the wills of deceased merchants.
The merchants of Bergen also developed highly institutionalized and deeply brutal initiation rites, known as the Bergen Games, designed to ruthlessly weed out the weak and enforce strict hierarchy among the young men. Conducted around Pentecost, new arrivals were subjected to 3 trials of physical torture. In the water games, novices were repeatedly thrown into the freezing harbor and beaten mercilessly with twigs whenever they resurfaced and tried to climb into a boat. The castle game involved a mock trial, ending with a severe beating inside a tent where musicians banged cymbals to drown out the screams. Finally, the smoke game involved lowering a trainee into a chimney where a noxious fire was lit. As the apprentice was slowly asphyxiated by biting smoke, he was forced to answer silly riddles, with incorrect answers resulting in extended, agonized torture. Operating with near total extraterritoriality, the merchants of the Bryggen routinely flouted Norwegian law. When a Hansard committed a major crime, such as murder, the League simply smuggled him onto a departing cog to escape royal justice, a practice that infuriated King Haakon VI. Following the devastating impact of the Black Death, which decimated Norway's population and agricultural output, the Hanseatic League essentially held the Norwegian crown hostage. By monopolizing the importation of cheap Baltic grain, upon which the surviving Norwegians depended, and by trapping local fishermen in predatory credit schemes, paying them upfront for fish at fixed prices that cut the fishermen out of any upward market shifts, the merchants exercised an unbreakable economic stranglehold. When local authorities attempted to push back, the Hansards resorted to horrific violence, on one occasion cutting down the royal bailiff, the local bishop, and 60 Norwegians before burning down a local monastery, all while the Norwegian king remained completely powerless to stop them. The Kontors suffered a major disaster in 1429 when the Lika dealers, a massive fleet of rogue pirates, launched a devastating raid on Bergen, plundering the town and burning it to the ground, though the Hanseatic merchants quickly rebuilt their profitable empire. In stark contrast to the extreme isolation of Novgorod or the staggering brutality of Bergen, the Hanseatic presence in London was heavily, inextricably woven into the financial survival of the English monarchy itself. The earliest documentary mention of a German commercial federation in London dates to 1176, when King Henry II issued an ordinance granting merchants from Cologne the unprecedented right to sell their Rhenish wine on the same market as French wine for a favorable price of 3 pence per pint. Shortly thereafter, Henry II granted them letters of protection to establish a massive guild hall on the shores of the River Thames to protect themselves and their wares. As the League formalized and the Easterlings, merchants from the East, arrived, this presence expanded into a massive, fully walled community located on the north bank of the River Thames, west of London Bridge, on the site currently occupied by the Cannon Street railway station. The Steelyard operated as an autonomous city within a city, entirely self-sufficient. It contained its own massive warehouses, weighhouses, living quarters, woningen, a chapel, and even a dedicated Rhenish winehouse. The merchants elected their own aldermen and only mixed with the local English population when absolutely required for business. Writing in the 16th century, the historian John Stowe documented the incredible variety of goods flowing through the Steelyard, including wheat,
rye, cables, ropes, masts, pitch, tar, flax, hemp, linen cloth, wainscots, wax, and steel. However, the name Steelyard did not primarily refer to the physical trade of steel. Instead, it was derived from the highly regulated trade of English cloth. When English cloth was sent to the Guildhall, it received an official lead or wax seal to definitively prove its origin, its quality, and that the relevant taxes had been paid. The process of attaching this seal was known as Stahlen in Low German. Consequently, the Guildhall was known as the Stahlhof, which English speakers poorly translated into Steelyard and later was retranslated into High German as Stahlhof. English cloth, highly prized for its exceptional quality and relative affordability compared to Flemish textiles, became the dominant export of the Steelyard, shipped in massive quantities to the Baltic and Germany. The relationship between the Hanseatic League and the English crown was highly transactional and fundamentally exploitative. English kings, chronically short of liquid capital to fund their endless military campaigns and crusades, repeatedly turned to the immensely wealthy Hanseatic merchants for massive loans. In 1194, King Richard the Lionheart granted the Cologne merchants sweeping tax exemptions in London, entirely releasing them from their annual rent and all other taxes in direct exchange for massive financial aid to pay his enormous ransom from Austrian captivity. In 1303, King Edward I officially confirmed the Steelyard's unprecedented tax and customs concessions through the Carta Mercatoria, merchant charter, establishing taxation on a national basis and forming the bedrock of the League's legal claims in England for the next 2.5 centuries.
These sweeping royal privileges, granted out of royal desperation, deeply infuriated the local English merchants, who found themselves severely, almost comically disadvantaged in their own capital city. English merchants were subject to heavy taxes, while the foreigners of the Steelyard operated tax-free. This localized resentment would eventually simmer into violence. King Henry IV once attacked the Steelyard and killed all within it, prompting the League to respond by instantly closing all ports to English ships, seizing vessels, and pillaging English cities until the Crown backed down. The Steelyard's immense wealth stood for centuries as a monument to the power of capital over the Crown, surviving numerous conflicts before finally being destroyed physically during the Great Fire of London in 1666, after which the property was merely let out as warehouses. The fourth, and arguably most vibrant major contour, was established in Bruges, located in the prosperous county of Flanders. Unlike the heavily fortified and isolated enclaves of London, Bergen, and Novgorod, the Hanseatic presence in Bruges was deeply and uniquely integrated into the urban fabric of the host city. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Bruges was the preeminent trading hub of northwestern Europe, a dazzling cosmopolitan metropolis where Hanseatic merchants exporting Baltic grain and English wool rubbed shoulders with wealthy traders from Spain, France, and the Italian city-states. In 1252, Countess Margaret of Flanders and her son Guy granted highly favorable privileges to the Holy Roman traders. However, when the Rhenish Westphalian grouping requested permission to build a walled, self-contained emporium enclave near the port of Dam, the Countess flatly denied the request. Bruges, desperate to secure its own absolute position over nearby towns, could not tolerate the creation of a rival walled city on its doorstep. Consequently, the Hansards were forced to rent lodging, storage, and meeting spaces directly from local Flemish landlords, spreading their presence throughout the town. They often met in the rented canteen of the local Carmelite monastery, before eventually acquiring the Oosterlingen House, or Easterling's House, at the Oosterlingen Square in 1442, a location named directly after the Easterners who did business there. To manage this highly dispersed population, the contour of Bruges developed a remarkably sophisticated administrative structure. Following a major institutional reform in 1347, the merchants were strictly divided into 3 geographic thirds based on their regional origins: the Wendish-Saxon third, the Westphalian-Prussian third, and the Gutnish-Livonian third.
Each third elected 2 aldermen, creating a board of 6 men who served 1-year terms to aggressively enforce internal discipline and represent the Kontor to outsiders. These aldermen were assisted by a board of 18 deputies, or octines, and by the mid-15th century, the Kontor employed highly literate university-trained clerks who provided expert legal counsel in Latin, massively professionalizing their diplomatic efforts. The main trading good in Bruges was luxurious Flemish broadcloth, which the Hanseatic merchants exported across the known world. Their presence brought such prosperity that Bruges experienced a golden century in the 15th century, marked by immense wealth and vibrant cultural events, such as the Procession of the Holy Blood, a reenactment of the Passion of Jesus Christ dating back to 1304, which is today recognized as intangible cultural heritage. However, the cosmopolitan nature of the city sometimes led to deep economic volatility. Following a severe scarcity of precious metals around 1390, Bruges mandated that all credit be paid in cash, featuring increasing shares of gold. This caused an acute shortage of cash, prompting the Kontor of Bruges and the leaders in Lübeck to impose a total, unyielding 3-year ban on all credit for Hanseatic traders in Flanders, starting in 1401, to stabilize their financial holdings. Because the merchants were so integrated into the city, the League could not easily rely on physical walls for leverage when disputes arose. Instead, they weaponized their supreme economic mobility. When conflicts occurred with the local authorities over taxation, weighing irregularities, or breaches of privilege, the Hanseatic Diet would order a total, unyielding commercial blockade of Flanders and physically relocate the entire Kontor to another city. In 1280 and 1307, they temporarily relocated to Aardenburg to protest weighing irregularities. In 1358, following intense disputes over taxes, the League relocated to Dordrecht and initiated a brutal blockade. This embargo cut off the flow of Baltic grain and nearly caused a massive famine, forcing Count Louis II to completely capitulate and extend Hanseatic privileges to the whole of Flanders. Similar punishing relocations occurred in 1388 to Dordrecht, in 1436 to Antwerp, and in 1457 to Utrecht. This ability to fluidly shift capital and commerce away from a hostile sovereign was the ultimate, terrifying expression of Hanseatic power. They didn't need to besiege a city with catapults and armies when they could simply bankrupt and starve it by leaving.
The Hanseatic League was fundamentally a commercial enterprise, and commerce traditionally abhors the massive expense and profound unpredictability of war. However, when their absolute monopolies were threatened, their vital trade routes blocked, or their hard-won privileges revoked, the League proved capable of mobilizing staggering military force, consistently defeating the established, heavily armored monarchies of Northern Europe. The most dramatic, world-altering demonstration of Hanseatic military supremacy occurred during their intense conflict with Valdemar Atterdag, or Waldemar Daun, the highly ambitious king of Denmark. In the 1360s, Valdemar sought to aggressively rebuild the fractured Danish kingdom that had virtually disintegrated under his predecessors, a grand project that required immense financial resources. Recognizing the incalculable wealth flowing through his territorial waters, he began levying heavy tolls on the vital herring trade and shipping through the Oresund, the Sound. In 1361, Valdemar escalated from taxation to open war, striking a direct blow against the League by conquering Scania, Åland, and the island of Gotland, brutally sacking the Hanseatic founding city of Visby. The initial Hanseatic naval counterattack in 1362 ended in total disaster when they were repelled by the Danish fleet at Helsingborg, resulting in a truce and the humiliating Treaty of Vordingborg, which stripped the League of its most lucrative trade privileges. Refusing to accept this devastating defeat, the merchants mobilized politically and militarily on a scale never before seen. On November 19, 1367, delegates from over 70 core Hanseatic cities and towns, including participants from Holland, Zeeland, and Zuiderzee, met in Cologne to form the Confederation of Cologne. This was a true, terrifying league of cities, a massive military alliance that explicitly set financial and military measures to combat the growing Danish threat, despite such alliances being theoretically prohibited by imperial law, though north of the Main River, nobody cared much about the emperor's laws. They instituted a strict, highly detailed league-wide taxation system, a poundage toll, to close export loopholes and finance the construction of a massive war fleet, with every city committing a specific number of ships and soldiers. Allied with Sweden, the Hanseatic Armada overwhelmed the Danish forces, bombarding Copenhagen and utterly defeating King Valdemar and his Norwegian son-in-law, Håkon VI, in the battles of the Second Waldemar War. The resulting Treaty of Stralsund, signed on May 24, 1370, marked the absolute peak of Hanseatic power. The treaty was negotiated and ratified on behalf of the crushed Danish state by Drost Henning Potebusk and Niels Jensen, while the triumphant Hanseatic League was represented by burgomasters Jakob Pleskau of Lübeck and Bertram Wolflam of Stralsund. Denmark was forced to officially re-establish Visby's freedom, guarantee unrestricted free trade across the entire Baltic Sea, and waive all taxes on German merchants in Scania. This granted the League a complete, unbreakable monopoly over the highly lucrative Baltic fish trade. Most astoundingly, the treaty gave the Union of Merchants unprecedented political leverage over Denmark's national sovereignty, granting the League the explicit right to veto candidates for the Danish throne and handing them control of the fortresses that dominated the herring fisheries. The Hansa's dominance, however, was continually tested by chaotic non-state actors, most notably the infamous Victual brothers, or Vitalienbrüders. Originally hired as state-sanctioned privateers in 1392 by the Dukes of Mecklenburg to support their war against Queen Margaret I of Denmark, who had besieged Stockholm and imprisoned the Swedish king, Albert of Mecklenburg, the mercenaries were tasked with running blockades to supply the besieged city with food, victuals. However, the group quickly realized that unchecked piracy was far more profitable than fighting a localized dynastic war. Initially, the Hanseatic League supported the privateers to prevent a decisive victory for Denmark, granting them safe harbor in cities like Rostock, Wismar, and Stralsund. But as the Victual brothers transitioned into open rogue piracy, they became a massive existential threat to the League itself. Operating primarily out of Visby on Gotland, which they occupied in 1394, they terrorized the Baltic Sea, severely damaging the regional herring industry and causing maritime trade to virtually collapse. By 1395, Queen Margaret gained the upper hand, formed the Kalmar Union, and forced the Hanseatic League to cooperate against the pirates. After the Teutonic Order invaded Gotland in 1398 and drove them out, the pirates rebranded themselves as the Likadealers, or equal sharers, because they supposedly shared their plunder with impoverished coastal populations, and shifted their operations into the North Sea, terrorizing coastal towns, and eventually launched a massive raid in 1429 that burned the trading town of Bergen to the ground.
The most legendary of these pirate captains was Klaus Stortebeker. His name, translating to "down the beakerful" in Low German, was supposedly earned because he could swallow 4 liters of beer without removing the cup from his mouth. Recognizing that the rampant piracy threatened the very survival of their entire trade network, the Hanseatic city of Hamburg took unilateral military action. In 1401, Hamburg dispatched a war fleet led by the heavily armed flagship Die Bunte Kuh, the Painted Cow, commanded by Simon of Utrecht. After a fierce 3-day running naval battle near Heligoland, Stortebeker and his crew were overpowered and captured. They were dragged back to Hamburg in chains and summarily executed, their heads staked as a gruesome warning to anyone who dared disrupt Hanseatic commerce. As the 15th century progressed, the deep resentment of local merchants against Hanseatic monopolies boiled over into massive state-level conflicts. In England, a rising class of domestic merchant adventurers grew deeply frustrated by the tax exemptions enjoyed by the Steelyard in London. Resenting that they had been pushed aside by the Hanse in Bergen and Scania, they began sailing directly into the Baltic Sea to purchase and ship Eastern goods themselves, bypassing the German middlemen. To protect local interests, the English crown began aggressively pressuring the League and revoking privileges, eventually escalating into the Anglo-Hanseatic War, 1469 to 1474, a brutal conflict fought primarily in the English Channel. The conflict was characterized by devastating, merciless commerce raiding. The Hanseatic League, led predominantly by the heavily armed cities of Danzig and Lübeck, unleashed privateers to utterly devastate English shipping. The most successful and terrifying of these commanders was Paul Beneke, captaining the mighty warship Peter von Danzig. From 1473 onward, Beneke ruthlessly raided the English coast, seizing vessels, and did not hesitate to capture neutral ships or vessels flying Burgundian flags if they were suspected of trading with the enemy. One of Beneke's most famous prizes occurred when he attacked the galleon San Matteo en route to Italy. Aboard the ship, Beneke captured an incredibly valuable triptych painting, The Last Judgment, painted by the legendary artist Hans Memling. Commissioned by the wealthy Florentine banker Angelo Towni for a chapel in Italy, the stolen masterpiece was brought back to Gdansk and placed in St. Mary's Church as a permanent spoil of war.
The English economy, already devastated by internal dynastic conflicts, the financial drain of the Wars of the Roses, and general poor management, collapsed under the weight of the Hanseatic naval blockade. King Edward IV, essentially bankrupt and unable to keep up the fight, was forced to sue for peace, signing the Treaty of Utrecht in 1474. The treaty was a total, humiliating capitulation for the English. It restored all special trading rights and Hanseatic privileges, granted the League absolute ownership of the London Steelyard, and yielded franchises and tax revenues to the Germans. Furthermore, it granted the League absolute ownership of trading bases in Boston and King's Lynn. The Hanseatic Warehouse in King's Lynn, constructed in 1475 as part of the treaty, was used continually until 1751 and stands today as the only remaining building of the Hanseatic League in England. The treaty virtually halted English trade with Germany and the Baltic region, and English merchants did not penetrate the region with confidence again until the Elizabethan era. While the League proved it could successfully suppress and bankrupt the English, the rising maritime power of the Dutch proved to be an insurmountable structural challenge. The Dutch-Hanseatic War, 1438 to 1441, erupted over control of Baltic shipping and the vital grain trade. Hanseatic cities, desperately trying to maintain their absolute monopoly, actively attempted to restrict Dutch trade with Livonia. In response to these restrictions, the County of Holland, acting independently of the rest of the Burgundian Netherlands, began employing heavily armed privateers against German shipping. On April 14, 1438, the Dutch administration formally declared war against the County of Holstein and 6 Wendish cities, Hamburg, Lübeck, Lüneburg, Greifswald, Stettin, and Anklam. The Dutch mobilized all suitable ships, ordering the rapid construction of 79 new vessels in May 1438 alone. Though there was little actual physical fighting, the Dutch fleet largely patrolled the Øresund, while a Wendish fleet blockaded the entrances to the Baltic Sea. This conflict critically exposed the deep internal fractures within the Hanseatic League. Demonstrating the limits of the Confederation, the Teutonic Order declared absolute neutrality, and the Prussian cities outright refused to provide any military assistance to support the League's war efforts. The political landscape shifted dramatically in 1440 when Eric of Pomerania was forced off the Danish throne. The new king, Christopher of Bavaria, though nominally allied with the Hanseatic cities, favored reconciliation and sought a rapid resolution, going so far as awarding Dutch traders the exact same rights as Hanseatic traders within Denmark. The war concluded with the Treaty of Copenhagen in September 1441. Based on the terms of the agreement, Dutch towns promised to return 22 lost Prussian and Livonian ships and pay 5,000 guldens to the Danish king to maintain their trading privileges, as well as paying damages to the Wendish towns.
However, despite paying these costly reparations, the treaty granted the Dutch unrestricted, unlimited access to the Baltic grain trade. This outcome provided a major long-term benefit for the Dutch over the German cities, resulting in the Hanseatic League permanently losing its absolute monopoly over grain. It proved definitively that a centralized, highly innovative maritime state could outcompete the rigid, privilege-based models of the League. The Treaty of Copenhagen was the first major irreparable crack in the Hanseatic edifice, signaling a long, slow decline that spanned the 16th and 17th centuries. The League did not collapse overnight from a single catastrophic military defeat. Rather, it slowly asphyxiated as the geopolitical, technological, and economic realities of the world shifted irrevocably beneath its feet. The fundamental, inescapable weakness of the Hanseatic League was structural. Even at the height of its power, the League remained a loosely aligned confederation. As it lacked a permanent administrative body, a central treasury, and a standing military force, the League was highly vulnerable and ill-equipped to compete in a new era defined by the rapid rise of the centralized nation-state. Across Europe, ambitious monarchs were consolidating absolute power and actively suppressing autonomous municipal authorities. In Sweden, following the War of Liberation, 1521 to 1523, King Gustavus Vasa pursued fiercely independent economic policies, refusing to support Lübeck's attempts to restrict Dutch trade and locking the Hansa out of local markets. When Lübeck aggressively overextended itself in the Counts' feud in 1536, it lost its regional influence and alienated Sweden, leading to a permanent decline in Nordic influence.
In England, the centralized Tudor state grew increasingly hostile to foreign monopolies that drained their domestic wealth. The growing power of English livery companies and guilds led to constant demands to challenge the League's special status. In 1551, King Edward VI revoked the merchants' special privileges, and although they were temporarily reinstated, Queen Elizabeth I permanently suppressed the Steelyard in 1598, rescinding all Hanseatic privileges and effectively expelling them from the London market. Simultaneously, German territorial princes began forcefully asserting authority over their local towns, stripping them of their independence. In 1442, Frederick II, Elector of Brandenburg, blocked Brandenburg towns like Berlin and Cologne from participating in Hanseatic diets, ending their involvement, a restriction enforced again by John Cicero on Stendal and Salzwedel in 1488. The geography of global commerce was also radically changing, rendering the Baltic Sea less central to world wealth. The discovery of the Americas and the establishment of new sea routes to India shifted the center of global trade away from the Baltic and North Seas toward the vast Atlantic Ocean. Ports in Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands exploded in wealth, bypassing the traditional Hanseatic transit routes entirely. Even within their own territories, the physical landscape betrayed them. In Bruges, the Zwin, the vital tidal inlet formed by a storm in 1134 that connected the city to the sea, began a terminal process of progressively silting up. By the middle of the 15th century, deep-draft ocean ships could no longer reach the city. Despite massive financial investments to dredge the channels, the geography was unforgiving and trade deteriorated severely. The center of Flemish trade inevitably shifted to Antwerp, and in 1520, the Hanseatic League officially decided to move its contour there, building the Oostershuis, signaling the end of Bruges' golden age. Furthermore, the foundational economic model of the League was entirely obsolete. The Hansa relied heavily on medieval systems of royal privileges, tax exemptions, and strict, enforced monopolies. The rising Dutch and English merchants operated on highly dynamic, modern capitalist principles, utilizing short-term contracts, joint stock companies, and bulk shipping to vastly undercut Hanseatic prices and adapt rapidly to shifting market demands. As foreign rulers increasingly repressed Hanseatic merchants, the major Kontors closed.
The Peterhof in Novgorod was permanently closed after facing a severe trade blockade and redirecting of the fur trade to Leipzig. When it briefly reopened in 1514, its importance had already petered out, and the Kontors was in ruins by the mid-16th century. As internal government crises and revolts occurred in cities like Lübeck, Wismar, and Rostock, the once unbreakable solidarity of the League completely shattered. During conflicts with Denmark and Holland, the eastern Prussian cities such as Danzig, Thorn, and Elbing, which became part of the autonomous province of Royal Prussia following the Prussian Confederation uprising in 1454, increasingly prioritized their own export of bulk timber and grain directly to the west over the diplomatic demands of Lübeck and the Wendish cities. Deprived of its monopolies, outmaneuvered by modern corporate structures, harassed by sovereign states, and physically separated by changing trade routes, the League quietly faded into obscurity. The final Hanseatic Diet was convened in 1669, a melancholic affair attended by only 9 remaining member cities. Though the spirit of the Confederation lingered in certain city-state titles, the Hanseatic League officially, quietly collapsed and dissolved in 1862. The history of the Hanseatic League offers a profound, unparalleled case study in the immense power and ultimate limitations of transnational economic integration. By forging a vast network built entirely on mutual commercial interest rather than military conquest, the merchants of the Hansa were able to bypass the rigid land-based hierarchies of feudalism. Through the brilliant implementation of Lübeck law, they created a stable bourgeois system of governance that ruthlessly prioritized long-term economic strategy over dynastic glory. Their establishment of the Great Kontors allowed them to completely monopolize the flow of essential commodities, from the squirrel furs of the Russian taiga that acted as currency to the broadcloth of English looms and the life-sustaining salted stockfish of the Baltic. Their ability to leverage this massive economic machinery into military and diplomatic supremacy, culminating in the complete humiliation of sovereign monarchs at the Treaty of Stralsund and the Treaty of Utrecht, demonstrated definitively that organized capital and logistics could humble even the most aggressive of kings. Yet the very mechanisms that guaranteed their unprecedented success, strict adherence to monopoly, rigid social control, and a total reliance on medieval royal privileges, ultimately proved fatal. When the global economic paradigm shifted toward transatlantic trade, joint stock capitalism, and free market competition, the League's decentralized structure prevented it from adapting. Though the Hanseatic League ultimately vanished, its legacy permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe, establishing the maritime trade routes that built modern economies, leaving behind a legacy of municipal autonomy and proving that a united network of merchants could build an empire of capital, a stateless, terrifyingly effective predecessor to the modern global economy.